The kitchen table felt colder than the December air seeping through the window cracks. Elias Moreno sat hunched over the worn wood surface, his calloused fingers smoothing out a single $50 bill like it was a prayer he couldn't quite remember how to say. The green paper caught the weak afternoon light filtering through glass that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Around the bill lay the evidence of a life stripped down to its bones. An overdue electric notice stamped in red ink, a grocery list written in his careful handwriting, and Sofia's school lunch account statement showing a balance of zero. $50. That's what stood between his daughter and hunger, between their small apartment and darkness. "Papa, are we still making tamales on Christmas Eve?" Sofia's voice drifted from the living room, where she sat cross-legged on the carpet, coloring in a book they'd found at the dollar store 3 weeks ago. Her crayons were worn down to nubs, but she colored with the same careful attention she gave everything else in her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elias looked up, his throat tight. 10 years old, and she still believed in Christmas miracles. Still believed her father could pull warmth and wonder from nothing but air and love. "See, mija," he said, folding the bill and sliding it into his worn leather wallet. "We'll make the best tamales this side of heaven." Sofia appeared in the doorway, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. She'd inherited her mother's eyes, deep brown and knowing, eyes that seemed to see right through his careful facades. "Mama always said you made them better than Abuela Rosa." The mention of Carmen hit him like it always did, a sudden ache that started in his chest and radiated outward. 2 years since the fever took her. 2 years since everything good in his life had to be rationed and stretched and prayed over. "Your mama was just being nice," he said, forcing a smile. "But we'll do our best." Sofia studied him with that unsettling perceptiveness children possess when they've learned too young that adults aren't as strong as they pretend to be. Then she disappeared back into the living room, returning moments later with something small and pink clutched in her hand. "Here," she said, pressing her worn mittens into his coat pocket, "just in case your hands get cold." Elias felt his chest constrict. The mittens were too small for his hands, had been too small for 2 years, but she always tried to take care of him in these quiet, careful ways. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, cherry sweet and innocent. "You keep those, sweetheart. I'll be fine." But she'd already stepped back, shaking her head with that stubborn tilt to her chin that reminded him so much of Carmen. "Mama always said we share what we have, even if it's little." The weight of her trust settled on his shoulders like snow. How did you explain to a child that $50 had to cover groceries, the electric bill, and her school lunches for the week? How did you tell someone who still believed in the goodness of the world that sometimes goodness wasn't enough to keep the lights on? He stood, his knees protesting after hours spent bent over repair manuals at the kitchen table. Since leaving the garage to care for Sofia, he'd been taking whatever work he could find. Fixing neighbors, appliances, shoveling sidewalks, anything that paid cash and let him be home when she got off the school bus. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. "I'm going to the store," he said, pulling on his coat. The fabric was thin at the elbows, but it would do. "You want to come?" Sofia looked up from her coloring book, where she was carefully shading a Christmas tree in deep green. "Can I finish this page first? I want to give it to Mrs. Chen at school tomorrow." "Of course." He kissed the top of her head. "Lock the door behind me, okay? I'll be back in an hour." The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside, sharp and clean and unforgiving. Snow had been falling since morning, not the heavy romantic kind that made the neighborhood look like a Christmas card, but the thin, persistent kind that soaked through your shoes and made everything look gray. He pulled his collar up and started walking toward Martinez Market 6 blocks away, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they came. The $50 bill sat heavy in his wallet, pressed against his leg with each step. Milk, bread, eggs, something for Sofia's lunch. Maybe some rice and beans if he was careful with the math. The electric company would have to wait another week. They'd threatened disconnection twice already, but somehow the light stayed on. Small mercies. As he walked, he thought about Carmen's hands kneading masa, her voice humming Christmas songs that made their tiny kitchen feel like the center of the universe. She'd made magic from nothing, turned poverty into abundance with laughter and love and the kind of faith that seemed ridiculous until you needed it most. Now it was just him and Sofia, and the careful arithmetic of survival. The streetlights flickered on as evening settled over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the snow-covered sidewalks. He walked faster, eager to get to the store and back before the cold could seep too deep into his bones. Behind him, the warm glow of his apartment window promised home and safety and the quiet contentment of his daughter's presence. He had no way of knowing that in 20 minutes everything would change. The shortcut through Maple Street had seemed like a good idea when Elias started walking. The narrow alley between the old hardware store and the abandoned bakery would shave 5 minutes off his trip, 5 minutes less time away from Sofia. The snow fell heavier here, muffling the sounds of the main street and creating a hushed, almost peaceful silence. That's why he heard the footsteps. They were quick and uneven, the sound of someone trying to walk fast without running. Elias glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure maybe 20 yards behind him, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a dark hoodie. The person's head was down, face hidden in shadow, but something about the hunched shoulders and jerky movements made Elias's stomach tighten. He picked up his pace. The footsteps behind him quickened too. Elias's mind raced through options. The mouth of the alley was still 30 yards ahead. Behind him, the footsteps were getting closer. His hand instinctively moved to his coat pocket, feeling for his phone, but all he found were Sofia's small mittens. "Hey!" The voice was young, male, edged with something that might have been desperation or fear. Elias turned, his body already tensing for whatever was coming. The kid couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His eyes darted everywhere except directly at Elias's face, and his hands shook as they emerged from his hoodie pockets. No weapon, just pale, trembling fingers and chewed-down fingernails. "Your wallet," the kid said, his voice cracking on the words. "Give me your wallet." For a moment they stood there in the falling snow, two men caught in a moment that would define everything that came after. Elias saw the fear in the kid's eyes, the way he kept glancing toward the street like he was afraid someone might see them. This wasn't practiced criminality. This was desperation wearing a thin disguise of aggression. "Look, son," Elias started. "Don't call me that." The kid's voice rose, shrill and panicked. "Just give me the wallet and nobody gets hurt." Elias raised his hand slowly, the way you might approach a wounded animal. Okay, let me just—" But the kid was too wired, too scared to wait. He lurched forward, his shoulders slamming into Elias's chest, hands grabbing for the coat pocket where the wallet rested. They stumbled together, Elias's feet sliding on the snow-slick pavement, the kid's fingers clawing desperately at the leather. Then it was over. The wallet was gone, and the kid was running, his sneakers slapping against wet concrete, as he disappeared around the corner. Elias stood alone in the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs, one hand pressed against the brick wall of the bakery for support. Gone. $50. Sofia's Christmas tamales. The electric bill. Everything. Elias, what happened? Marta Alvarez appeared at the mouth of the alley, her round face creased with concern. She must have been taking out the trash from her corner store, because she still wore her apron and held a bag of garbage in one hand. "I'm okay," Elias said automatically, though he wasn't sure that was true. His chest ached where the kid had hit him, and his hands were shaking. "You don't look okay." Marta dropped the garbage bag and hurried toward him, her sneakers squelching in the slush. "What happened? Did someone hurt you?" "A kid," Elias said, still staring toward the corner where his attacker had vanished. "He took my wallet." Marta's face darkened. "Dios mío! Did you call the police? Was it one of those punk kids from the east side?" "I don't know. I've never seen him before." Elias pulled out his phone with shaking fingers. He was young. Scared, I think. "Scared?" Marta's voice rose an octave. "He robbed you, Elias. In broad daylight. You can't just—" She stopped herself, studying his face in the dim light. "How much did he get?" Elias closed his eyes. "Everything." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of falling snow and the distant hum of traffic from the main street. Marta knew, had always known, how tight things were for him and Sofia. She'd been the one to slip extra groceries into his bag when she thought he wasn't looking, the one to hire him for odd jobs around the store when she could have done the work herself. "Call the police," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "Call them right now. This neighborhood used to be safe. Used to be a place where people looked out for each other. Now we've got kids running around, stealing from hardworking men with families to feed." Elias nodded, but he didn't dial. Something held him back. Some image that wouldn't leave his mind. The kid's hollow cheeks. The way his hands had shaken. The fear in his voice when he'd said those words. "Your wallet." Not like he'd practiced them, like they'd been torn from his throat. "Elias?" Marta touched his arm. "Call them. Don't let this slide." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I will." But as they walked back toward the street together, Marta's hand protective on his elbow, Elias found himself thinking not about justice or punishment, but about the look in that kid's eyes. The same look he'd seen in his own mirror too many times lately. The look of someone who'd run out of choices. The apartment felt different when Elias returned, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together while he was gone. Sofia looked up from her coloring book as he came through the door, her face bright with expectation. "Did you get the milk?" she asked. "I was thinking we could have cereal for dinner if you're too tired to cook." Elias hung his coat on the hook by the door, his movements careful and deliberate. The empty space where his wallet should have been felt like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "We'll figure something out, Mija." She tilted her head, studying him with those knowing eyes. "You look sad. Did something happen at the store?" How did you explain to a 10-year-old that the $50 meant for her food and their electricity had walked away in the pocket of a desperate stranger? How did you tell someone who still believed in goodness that sometimes good people did bad things for reasons that made no sense at all? "Just tired," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Show me what you're working on." Sofia held up her coloring book, displaying a carefully shaded Santa Claus surrounded by presents. Every line was precise, every color chosen with deliberation. She worked the way she did everything else, with a quiet intensity that reminded him so much of Carmen it sometimes took his breath away. "It's for Mrs. Chen," she said. "She told us her grandson lives in China and she won't see him this Christmas. I thought maybe this would help her not feel so lonely." The weight of her innocence settled over him like a blanket. Here she was, 10 years old and worrying about other people's loneliness, while her own father sat across from her trying to figure out how to keep the lights on for another week. "She'll love it," he said, and meant it. Sofia went back to her coloring, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on Santa's belt. The sight of her, so peaceful and trusting in their small haven, made Elias's chest tight with something that might have been love or might have been panic. The phone rang. "Moreno residence," Elias answered, though he already knew who it would be. "Elias, it's Jonah. Marta called me about what happened tonight." Officer Jonah Price had grown up 3 streets over, had known Carmen since they were both in high school. He'd been the one to drive Elias to the hospital the night she died, had sat with him in the waiting room when Sofia was too young to understand why her mother wouldn't wake up. "I'm fine, Jonah, really." "Maybe, but robbery is robbery. Marta said you got a good look at the guy." Elias closed his eyes, seeing again those hollow cheeks, those shaking hands. Young kid, maybe 20, tall, thin, dark hoodie. "Could you pick him out of a lineup?" The question hung in the air between them. Sofia looked up from her coloring, sensing the shift in her father's voice. She didn't understand the words, but she understood tension, had learned to read the subtle signs of adult worry. "I don't know," Elias said finally. "Look, I get it, you don't want to make trouble, but this kid, whoever he is, he's going to do this to someone else, maybe someone who can't afford to lose what he takes. Maybe someone who fights back and gets hurt." Elias thought about this, about other fathers walking home to their children empty-handed, about other families sitting in dark apartments because $50 walked away in the wrong pocket. "Can I think about it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sure, but don't think too long, okay? The longer we wait, the colder the trail gets." After Jonah hung up, Elias sat staring at the phone. Sofia had abandoned her coloring and was watching him with that expression she wore when she was trying to solve a puzzle that had too many pieces. "Papá? Are we in trouble?" The question hit him like a physical blow. She was 10 years old. She should be worried about homework and what to watch on television, not about whether her father could keep food on the table. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble." But even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. The electric bill would have to wait another week, maybe two. They had some leftover rice in the pantry, half a loaf of bread in the freezer. They could make it work. They always made it work. Sofia stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a small glass jar covered in princess stickers. She'd been saving change in it for months, adding nickels and dimes whenever she found them on the street or in the couch cushions. "Here," she said, setting the jar on the table in front of him, "you can have this." The trust in her voice, the simple generosity of the gesture, broke something open inside his chest. This was what Carmen had meant when she used to say that second chances should be given before the first mistake grew too deep. This was the kind of faith that looked beyond what people did to why they did it. "Keep your money, Mija," he said gently, "but thank you." She sat back down and picked up her crayons, but he could feel her watching him, waiting. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the neighborhood in quiet white. Somewhere out there, a desperate kid was probably counting $50 and wondering if it was enough to solve whatever problem had driven him to take from a stranger in an alley. Elias thought about calling Jonah back, about giving a description detailed enough to put that kid in handcuffs, about teaching him that actions had consequences, and that you couldn't just take what you needed from people who had even less. But then he looked at Sofia, bent over her coloring book, working so carefully on a picture meant to comfort a lonely old woman. He thought about Carmen's voice. "Second chances, Elias. Sometimes that's all that stands between someone and the dark." He picked up the phone, but instead of calling Jonah, he set it back down. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would go looking for the kid with the hollow cheeks and shaking hands. Not to turn him in, but to understand why a stranger's $50 had seemed like the answer to whatever question was eating him alive. It was probably stupid. It was probably dangerous, but as he watched his daughter color presents under Santa's tree, each one drawn with the kind of hope that believed in transformation, Elias knew it was also probably right. The morning came gray and bitter, with ice forming delicate patterns on the apartment windows. Elias woke before dawn, his mind already turning over the decision that had kept him restless through the night. Sofia slept peacefully in her small bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, one hand clutching the worn teddy bear that had been Carmen's last gift to her. He dressed quietly, pulling on his heaviest coat and the work boots that had seen him through 2 winters of odd jobs and careful budgeting. In the kitchen, he wrote a note for Sofia, "Gone to run errands, back by lunch. There's oatmeal in the pot. I love you," and propped it against the salt shaker where she'd be sure to see it. The cold hit him like a slap as he stepped outside. The neighborhood looked different in daylight, smaller and more fragile under its coating of snow. Children's voices echoed from the schoolyard 3 blocks away, a reminder that life continued its normal rhythms, even when your own world had tilted sideways. Marta's corner store sat on the corner of Pine and 3rd, its neon open sign flickering against the morning gloom. She looked up when the bell chimed his entrance, her face creasing with concern. "Elias, you look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" "Some." He approached the counter where she stood sorting receipts, her movements quick and efficient. "I need to ask you something." Marta's hand stilled. "If this is about what happened yesterday, you should be talking to the police, not me. That kid who took my wallet, have you seen him around the neighborhood before?" She studied his face, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence. Marta had raised 3 sons of her own, had learned to read the signs when a man was walking toward trouble. "Why?" "I just want to find him." "To do what exactly?" Her voice carried a warning note. "Elias, you're not a young man anymore, and you're not a fighter. You go looking for this kid, you could get hurt." "I'm not going to hurt him." "Then what?" The question hung between them like smoke. Elias found himself thinking about Sofia's coloring book, about the careful way she'd drawn each present under Santa's tree, about Carmen's voice saying that sometimes second chances were all that stood between someone and the dark. "I want to understand," he said finally. Marta shook her head, but something in his tone must have convinced her of his sincerity. She walked to the window, looking out at the street where morning commuters hurried past with their heads down and their hands shoved deep in their pockets. "There's a boarding house on Elm Street," she said without turning around. "Mrs. Rodriguez runs it, takes in kids who don't have anywhere else to go. Sometimes I see them coming in here for cigarettes and energy drinks, young men with hollow eyes and quick hands. You think he might be staying there? Maybe. Or maybe he's just passing through. These kids, they don't stay put for long. She turned back to face him. Elias, what you're thinking of doing? It's not smart. This boy took your money, your family's money. You call the police, let them handle it. But Elias was already moving toward the door. Thank you, Marta. Don't thank me, she called after him. Just don't get yourself killed being stupid. The boarding house squatted like a gray tooth among the row houses on Elm Street. Paint peeled from its siding in long, curling strips, and the front porch sagged under the weight of too many winters. A hand-painted sign in the window read rooms by week, and below it someone had taped a smaller notice. No drugs. No noise after 10 p.m. No exceptions. Elias stood across the street, studying the building and the people who came and went. A woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression emerged from the front door, shaking out a small rug with sharp, efficient movements. Mrs. Rodriguez, he assumed. He was about to cross the street when he saw him. The kid from the alley stepped out of the narrow space between two buildings, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of the same dark hoodie. He moved with the quick, nervous energy of someone who expected trouble, his eyes constantly scanning the street. Elias felt his heart rate spike. There he was, the person who had taken everything they had left. But looking at him now, in daylight, Elias was struck again by how young he seemed. How thin. The hoodie hung loose on his frame, and his jeans looked like they'd been slept in. The kid, Dante, though Elias didn't know his name yet, walked quickly down Elm Street, staying close to the buildings as if trying to make himself invisible. Elias followed at a distance, his footsteps muffled by the snow that had fallen overnight. They walked for 6 blocks, Dante's pace never slowing, his head turning constantly to check behind him. Finally, he ducked into an alley beside an abandoned gas station. Elias hesitated at the mouth of the alley, then stepped into the shadows. Dante wasn't alone. A thin man with graying hair and sharp features stood with his back against the brick wall of the gas station. His clothes were expensive, a leather jacket that looked new, boots that had never seen honest work. Everything about him screamed money and menace. "You got my 50?" the man asked, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Yeah, I got it." Dante's voice was different than it had been in their confrontation. Smaller, younger. "But Spider, I need more time for the rest. Just until after Christmas." "Christmas?" The man, Spider, laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What do you think this is, kid? A charity?" Elias pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. $50. His $50, being handed over to this predator who wore violence like cologne. "I can get the rest," Dante said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I just need a few more days." "You needed a few more days last week. And the week before that." Spider pushed himself off the wall, moving closer to Dante. "I'm starting to think you're not taking this seriously." "I am, I swear." You just what? Spent it on drugs, women, gambling?" "Food," Dante said quietly. "I spent it on food." The admission hung in the cold air between them. Elias felt something twist in his chest, not anger at having his money stolen, but recognition. The hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had to choose between dignity and survival. Spider backhanded Dante casually, the way someone might swat a fly. The sound echoed off the alley walls, sharp and ugly. Dante stumbled but didn't fall, one hand coming up to touch his cheek. "Grow up, kid. Food is what you buy after you pay your debts. You got until New Year's Day to get me the rest of what you owe. That's 200 more, in case you forgot." "I didn't forget." "Good. Because if you do, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." Spider walked past Dante toward the mouth of the alley, his boots crunching on broken glass. He passed within 3 feet of where Elias stood, hidden in the shadows, so close that Elias could smell his cologne and see the cold calculation in his pale eyes. After he was gone, Dante stood alone in the alley, his hand still pressed to his cheek. His shoulders shook, whether from cold or something else, Elias couldn't tell. $200. His 50 had been just the beginning, a desperate attempt to buy time in a game that was rigged against him from the start. Elias stepped out of the shadows. Dante spun around, his eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, they stared at each other. The victim and the thief, both caught in a moment that would define everything that came next. "Easy," Elias said, raising his hands. "I just want to talk." But Dante was already moving, bolting toward the far end of the alley like a rabbit flushed from cover. Elias let him go, standing alone among the broken glass and cigarette butts, thinking about the sound of that slap and the way Dante's shoulders had shaken in the cold. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would try again. The downtown laundromat sat wedged between a pawn shop and a check-cashing place, its windows fogged with steam and its fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh, clinical white. Elias had been watching from across the street for 20 minutes when Dante finally appeared, a black garbage bag slung over his shoulder like a dejected Santa Claus. The kid moved differently today, slower, more careful. The left side of his face bore a purple bruise where Spider had hit him, and he kept one hand pressed against his ribs as if something there hurt. He pushed through the laundromat's glass door and disappeared into the humid warmth inside. Elias crossed the street. The smell hit him first. Industrial detergent mixed with bleach and the stale scent of clothes that had been dirty too long. A handful of washing machines churned and sloshed, their mechanical rhythm oddly soothing. An elderly woman in a house dress folded towels at one of the plastic tables, humming tunelessly to herself. Dante stood at the far end of the room, feeding quarters into an ancient washing machine that looked like it had been old when Carter was president. His movements were stiff, careful, confirming Elias's suspicion that Spider had done more than just slap him. "That machine eats quarters," Elias said, walking up behind him. Dante spun around so fast he stumbled, his hand flying to his ribs. When he saw who it was, his face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, anger, and finally resignation. "What do you want?" His voice was hoarse, tired. "To talk." "About what? Getting your money back?" Dante's laugh was bitter. "Little late for that." Elias studied the young man's face. The bruise, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that held too much knowledge for someone barely out of his teens. Up close, he looked even younger than he had in the alley, a kid playing at being dangerous because the alternative was being prey. "Come on," Elias said, nodding toward the row of plastic chairs near the window. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Elias walked to the vending machine in the corner and fed it $1. 2 cups of coffee dropped into the slot, steam rising from their plastic rims. He brought them back, holding one out to Dante. "When's the last time you ate something?" Dante stared at the coffee like it might be poisoned. "Why do you care?" "Good question." Elias sat down, wincing slightly as his knees protested. "Maybe because I have a daughter your age, and I'd want someone to care if she was in trouble." "I'm not your daughter." "No, but you're somebody's son." The words hit their mark. Dante's face tightened, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered in his eyes before the walls went back up. He said quietly, "was somebody's son." They sat in silence for a moment, the washing machines providing a rhythmic backdrop to their conversation. The elderly woman finished her folding and left, the door chiming behind her. Now it was just the two of them in the humid fluorescent warmth. "What's your name?" Elias asked. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of thinking of you as the kid who took my wallet." Another pause. Then, "Dante." "Dante, I'm Elias." He sipped his coffee, which tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. "Tell me about Spider." Dante's entire body went rigid. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. Thin guy, expensive jacket, hits kids half his size. I saw you with him yesterday." "You were following me." "I was looking for you. There's a difference." Dante stood abruptly, then immediately sat back down as his ribs protested. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but—" "No game." Elias leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Just one question. Why my $50? The directness of it seemed to catch Dante off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away toward the window where condensation traced lazy patterns down the glass. "Because you looked like you wouldn't fight back," he said finally. The honesty of it was brutal. Elias felt the words like a physical blow, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were true. He had looked like easy prey, a tired man in worn clothes walking alone through an alley. "You were right," Elias said. "I didn't fight back." "So what do you want, a medal?" "I want to understand what $200 is worth to a kid like you." Dante's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "How do you?" "I heard Spider, the rest of what you owe." "What did you do to get into debt with someone like that?" For a long moment, Dante just stared at him. Then something seemed to break inside him, like a dam finally giving way under too much pressure. "I got fired," he said quietly, "from the warehouse job. Showed up late too many times because I was staying up all night in the shelter, listening to crazy people talk to themselves. Couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, couldn't do anything right." He rubbed his face with hands that shook slightly. "Spider offered me a loan. Said it was just temporary, just until I got back on my feet." "How much?" "Started at 100, but the interest—" Dante's voice trailed off. "It's like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink." Elias thought about his own struggles with money, the careful arithmetic of survival that governed every decision he made. But at least he had a home. A daughter who loved him, neighbors who cared. This kid had nothing but the clothes in that garbage bag, and whatever change was left from stolen $50 bills. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Elias asked. Dante shrugged. "Define real." "Something that wasn't out of a vending machine or a garbage can." The silence stretched between them. Outside, snow had started falling again, dusting the cars parked along the street with fresh white. "There's a diner across the street," Elias said finally. "They make a decent hamburger, won't solve your problems, but it might help you think clearer." Dante stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "Because somebody should." "I stole from you." "Yeah, you did." Elias stood, his knees protesting again. "But you also look like you haven't had a kind word or a hot meal in longer than anyone should have to go without either." He walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. Dante sat frozen in his chair, the cup of cooling coffee clutched in his hands like an anchor. "I'll be at the diner for an hour," Elias said. "If you want to talk, come talk. If you want to eat, come eat. If you want to disappear, well, I can't stop you." He pushed through the door into the cold, leaving Dante alone with the washing machines and the choice. The diner looked like it had been transplanted from 1955 and forgotten about. Red vinyl booths cracked with age, black and white checkered floor worn smooth by decades of working-class feet, and the kind of coffee that could wake the dead or kill them, depending on their constitution. Elias chose a booth near the window, where he could watch the laundromat across the street. He'd been nursing a cup of coffee for 15 minutes when the door chimed and Dante walked in. The kid stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the diner like he was cataloging escape routes. His garbage bag was gone, probably stuffed into one of the washing machines, and without its bulk, he looked even thinner than before. The hostess, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and sensible shoes, approached him with a menu. "Sit anywhere you like, honey," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime feeding people. Dante's eyes found Elias, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the diner. Then Dante walked over and slid into the booth across from him, moving carefully to avoid jarring his ribs. "I'm not hungry," he said. "Okay," Elias signaled the waitress. "2 coffees and 2 of the beef stew specials." "I said I'm not hungry." "And I heard you. But when's the last time you ate something that wasn't processed sugar and caffeine?" Dante didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. The waitress brought coffee and a basket of rolls, setting them down with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. "Stew will be up in 5 minutes," she said, refilling Elias's cup. "You boys want anything else?" "We're good, thanks," Elias said. After she left, they sat in silence for a while. Dante stared out the window at the falling snow, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth. Finally, almost despite himself, he reached for one of the rolls. "So," Elias said, watching Dante butter the bread with careful, precise movements, "foster care?" Dante's hand stilled. "How'd you know?" "Lucky guess. The way you eat, like someone might take it away. The way you watch doors, like you're always ready to run. I've seen it before." "Where?" "My wife used to volunteer at a group home. before she died. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to find. Dante took a bite of the roll, chewed thoughtfully, swallowed. "How long ago?" he asked. 2 years. Cancer came fast. Took her faster." "Sorry." "Yeah, me too." Elias sipped his coffee, which had improved since the first cup, or maybe he was just getting used to it. "How old were you when you went into the system?" 8. Dante's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "Mom died of an overdose. Never knew my dad." "Rough start." "Could have been worse." "Some of the homes were okay. Some weren't." He shrugged, a gesture that was meant to look casual but carried the weight of years. "Aged out at 18 with a garbage bag full of clothes and $200 in gift cards. Been figuring it out ever since." The stew arrived, steaming bowls of beef and vegetables in thick brown gravy, served with chunks of crusty bread. Dante stared at his bowl like he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Eat," Elias said gently. "It's not going anywhere." Slowly, Dante picked up his spoon. The first bite was tentative, careful. The second was larger. By the third, he was eating with the focused intensity of someone who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. "When's the last time you had a place to sleep that wasn't a shelter or a doorway?" Elias asked. "Had a room at Mrs. Rodriguez's place for a while, until I couldn't make rent." Dante paused between bites. "That's when I met Spider. He said he could help me out, just temporary. Said a young guy like me, willing to work, could make good money running errands for him." "What kind of errands?" "The kind you don't ask questions about." Dante's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Delivered packages. Picked up packages. Sometimes I'd stand on a corner and watch for cops while other people did business. Nothing violent. Nothing that would get me serious time if I got caught. Just enough to pay rent and buy food. But not enough to pay back the loan. The interest was killing me. 20% a week. I'd pay him 50, still owe 60. Pay him 60, still owe 72. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom." Elias did the math in his head. Started at $100, compounding weekly at 20%. In 3 months, the debt would triple. In 6 months, it would be impossible to pay back on minimum wage, even if you could find steady work. "That's when you decided to start taking from people on the street." Dante's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "I'm not a thief." "No?" "Not by choice, not by nature." His voice carried an edge of defensiveness. "You think I wanted to mug some guy walking home from the store? You think I enjoyed scaring the hell out of you? Then why did you?" The question hit home. Dante set down his spoon and stared at the table, his jaw working like he was chewing words too bitter to swallow. "Because Spider said if I didn't have his money by Christmas, he'd make an example of me. And I've seen what his examples look like." He touched his ribs gingerly. "This was just a reminder. The real thing would be a lot worse. What would happen if you just left town? Where would I go? I don't have money for a bus ticket, don't have family anywhere else. And guys like Spider, they have friends in other cities. Run from one, you might end up owing two." They finished their stew in relative silence, the weight of Dante's situation settling between them like snow. Outside, the world was turning white again, the kind of clean, forgiving white that made everything look possible. "I have a proposition," Elias said finally. Dante looked up, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "What kind of proposition?" "Work. Real work. Honest work. I've got neighbors who need snow shoveled, gutters cleaned, small repairs done. Pays not much, but it's cash and it's legal." "Why would you do that?" "Because everybody deserves a chance to choose something different." Dante stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for the catch, the angle, the hidden cost. "What do you want in return?" $50. My $50. When you can afford it." "That's it?" "That's it." The waitress came by with the check. Elias paid with cash, leaving a decent tip for someone who understood the value of a hot meal and a warm place to sit. As they stood to leave, Dante caught his arm. "What if I screw this up?" he asked. "What if I take your help and then disappear with whatever money you front me?" Elias considered this. "Then I'll be out a few dollars and you'll still be in the same hole you're in now. But maybe you won't. Maybe this time will be different." "How can you be sure?" "Be'amalu." "I can't. But my wife used to say that hope was the only currency that never lost its value. So I'm spending a little hope on you, Dante. Try not to waste it all in one place." They walked out into the snow together, two men who'd found something unexpected in a conversation that should have been about justice and punishment, but had turned instead into something that might have been the beginning of redemption. The morning air bit at their faces as Elias and Dante made their way down Maple Street, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the wind. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, blanketing the neighborhood in pristine white that would soon turn gray under the weight of car exhaust and foot traffic. But for now, in the early morning quiet, everything looked clean and possible. "Mrs. Hernandez first," Elias said, shouldering a snow shovel he'd borrowed from Marta's store. "She's 83, and her grandson usually does her walkway, but he's been laid up with a broken leg." Dante walked beside him, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face unreadable. He'd shown up at the appointed time and place, which was something. But there was a tension in his shoulders, a weariness in his eyes that suggested he was still waiting for the catch. "How much does this pay?" he asked. $20 per driveway. We'll split it." $10? Dante's voice carried a note of disbelief. "I can make more than that in an hour with Spider." "Doing what?" Dante was quiet for a moment. "Nothing I'd want to tell your daughter about." They turned onto Pine Street, where Mrs. Hernandez's small house sat like a gingerbread cottage behind a snow-covered fence. Elias had known her for 15 years, had fixed her garbage disposal twice and her washing machine once. She was the kind of neighbor who brought you soup when you were sick and remembered your birthday even when you forgot it yourself. "Elias," she called from her front window, her voice muffled by the glass. "You didn't have to come all this way." "It's no trouble, Mrs. Hernandez," he called back. "We'll have you cleared out in no time." He handed Dante the second shovel and they set to work. The snow was heavy and wet, the kind that stuck to everything and made your back ache after the first 10 minutes. But there was something satisfying about the rhythm of it, the simple physics of moving snow from where it was to where it needed to be. Dante worked awkwardly at first, like someone who'd spent more time running from honest work than doing it. But gradually he found his rhythm, his movements becoming more efficient. Elias watched him from the corner of his eye, noting the way Dante's face relaxed slightly as he worked, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You ever do this kind of work before?" Elias asked during a brief rest. "Some. When I was 14, I lived with a family that had me doing yard work for spending money. The Kowalskis." Dante leaned on his shovel, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "They were good people, lasted there almost 2 years. "What happened?" "They moved to Florida, couldn't take me with them." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Elias heard the old hurt underneath. New family wasn't as understanding. They finished Mrs. Hernandez's walkway in 40 minutes, piling the snow neatly along the edges of her front yard. She came out as they were putting the finishing touches on her front steps, bundled in a thick coat and carrying a thermos. "Hot chocolate," she said, pouring steaming liquid into 2 paper cups, with a little something extra to keep the cold out. The chocolate was rich and sweet, with a warming bite that suggested the something extra was rum. Dante accepted his cup with obvious surprise, like he wasn't used to kindness from strangers. "This is my friend Dante," Elias said. "He's helping me out today." Mrs. Hernandez studied Dante with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. "You boys did beautiful work. Here." She pressed a $20 bill into Elias's hand, then surprised them both by pressing another 10 into Dante's. "For the young man, he works hard." As they walked away, Dante stared at the $10 bill like it was a foreign currency. "She just gave me money for shoveling snow." That's how honest work tends to go. But she doesn't even know me. She knows you did good work. Sometimes that's enough. Their next stop was Marta's store, where a loose shutter had been banging against the building every time the wind picked up. Marta greeted them with her usual combination of warmth and skepticism. "So this is the young man who's been causing all the trouble," she said, looking Dante up and down like she was evaluating livestock. Dante's face flushed. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you don't look like much, but Elias seems to think you're worth the investment, so I suppose we'll see." She pointed to the ladder propped against the building. "Shutter's loose on the left side. Should be an easy fix if you're not afraid of heights." Dante proved to be surprisingly handy with tools, his movements quick and sure as he tightened the loose bolts and adjusted the shutter's alignment. Elias held the ladder steady, watching the young man work with something that might have been pride. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked when Dante climbed down. "The Kowalskis. Mr. K was always fixing something. Said a man should know how to work with his hands." Marta emerged from the store with 2 cups of coffee and a small bag of pastries. "Not bad," she admitted grudgingly. "Maybe you're not completely hopeless after all." They spent the rest of the morning working their way through the neighborhood, clearing sidewalks and fixing small problems that winter had revealed. With each job, Dante seemed to grow more confident, his movements less tentative. By noon, they'd earned $60 between them. As they stopped for lunch at a small cafe, Dante counted his share of the money with careful fingers. $30, he said, wonder in his voice. For 4 hours of work. Not bad for an honest day's labor. It's not enough, though. The reality of his situation settled back over him like a shadow. Spider wants 200. This would take me weeks, and I don't have weeks. Elias stirred his coffee, thinking. Outside, snow continued to fall, turning the world soft and quiet. What if we could find you more work? Steady work? Doing what? I don't have a high school diploma. Don't have references. Don't have an address that isn't a shelter. But you can work. I saw that today. You're good with your hands. You show up when you say you will, and you don't give up when things get difficult. Dante was quiet for a long moment, staring at the bills in his hand. Why are you doing this? Really? Elias thought about Sofia, asleep in their warm apartment. About Carmen, who'd believed that everyone deserved a chance to choose something different. About the choices he'd made in his own life, the times when someone had extended a hand when they didn't have to. "Because I think you're worth saving," he said finally, "and because my daughter is watching to see what kind of man her father is." They were walking back toward Elias's apartment when the black sedan pulled up alongside them. Dante tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his ribs. Spider rolled down the passenger window, his pale eyes fixed on Dante with predatory intensity. "Well, well, look who's playing in the snow." "Spider!" Dante's voice was carefully neutral, but Elias could see the fear underneath. "You got something for me, kid? Because time's running out on our little arrangement." Dante glanced at Elias, then back at Spider. "I'm working on it." "Working on it?" Spider's laugh was like breaking glass. "That's not what I want to hear. What I want to hear is, 'Yes, sir, I have your money, sir.' I need more time. Time's a luxury you can't afford." Spider's eyes shifted to Elias, cataloging and dismissing him in a single glance. "Who's your friend?" "Nobody," Dante said quickly. "Just somebody I know." "Nobody, huh?" Spider smiled, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Well, nobody. You might want to find yourself some different company. This kid's got debts to pay, and I don't like it when my business gets complicated by well-meaning strangers." The sedan pulled away, leaving them standing on the snow-covered sidewalk. Dante's hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "I should go," he said. "This was a mistake. I shouldn't have dragged you into this." But before Elias could respond, Dante was walking away, his footsteps quick and urgent in the snow. Within moments, he'd disappeared around the corner, leaving Elias alone with the echo of Spider's threat and the knowledge that his gamble on redemption had just become something much more dangerous. Elias waited at the diner for 2 hours the next morning, nursing coffee that grew cold in his hands while he watched the door for a figure that never appeared. The waitress from the day before, Betty, according to her name tag, refilled his cup 3 times and finally asked if he was waiting for someone. "I was," he said, leaving money on the table, "but I don't think he's coming." The walk home felt longer than usual, his feet heavy with something that might have been disappointment or might have been fear. Sofia was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on a math worksheet with the kind of focused concentration she brought to everything important. "How's your friend?" she asked without looking up from her division problems. "What friend?" "The one you've been thinking about. You get that look when you're worried about someone." She glanced up, her dark eyes serious, like when Mama was sick. The observation hit him like a physical blow. Had he been that transparent? Or was his daughter just that perceptive? "He's having some troubles," Elias said carefully. "The kind of troubles the police help with?" "Maybe. I don't know yet." Sofia nodded gravely. as if this made perfect sense to her 10-year-old logic. Mama used to say that sometimes helping people means letting them figure things out for themselves. Your mother was a smart woman. She was. But she also said that sometimes people need help, whether they ask for it or not. Elias kissed the top of her head, marveling at the wisdom hidden in her small frame. Finish your homework. I need to make some phone calls. But when he called the boarding house on Elm Street, Mrs. Rodriguez told him that Dante hadn't been back in 2 days. When he checked the laundromat, the attendant said she hadn't seen him either. It was as if the young man had simply vanished, like snow melting under the winter sun. By evening, Elias was genuinely worried. He'd walked through the neighborhood twice, checked the shelter downtown, even stopped by the diner where they'd eaten together. Nothing. Dante had disappeared as completely as if he'd never existed. It was Marta who brought the news. She appeared at his door just after sunset, her face grim and her hands twisted in her apron. "Elias, I think your boy might be in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "I saw him this afternoon, or I think I saw him, in the alley behind the old Murphy building. That man from yesterday, the one in the expensive car, he was dragging someone who looked like Dante into the back of a warehouse." Elias felt his blood turn to ice. "Are you sure?" "Sure enough to tell you about it, but not sure enough to call the police. You know how they are about things that happen in that part of town." The Murphy building sat in the industrial district, a hulking brick structure that had been empty for 5 years since the textile factory closed. Elias knew the area well. It was where desperate people went when they needed to disappear, where transactions happened that couldn't bear the light of day. "Where exactly?" he asked, already reaching for his coat. "Elias, no," Marta caught his arm. "That's not a place for someone like you. Call Jonah. Let the police handle this." "And tell him what? That I think someone might be hurting a kid who mugged me 3 days ago? You said it yourself. They won't care about things that happen in that part of town." "Then maybe that should tell you something about going there yourself." But Elias was already moving, checking his pockets for his keys and his phone. The thought of Dante alone and afraid, paying the price for their brief partnership, made his chest tight with something that felt like panic. "What are you going to do?" Marta called after him. "Whatever I have to." The warehouse district looked like a mouthful of broken teeth in the fading light. Empty buildings with dark windows stared down at snow-covered streets, where the only footprints belonged to stray cats and people who preferred not to be seen. Elias parked his truck 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The Murphy building loomed against the darkening sky, its brick facade stained with decades of weather and neglect. A single light glowed in one of the upper windows, and Elias could see shadows moving behind the glass. He found the entrance Marta had described, a loading dock behind the building where trucks had once picked up finished goods bound for department stores across the country. The metal door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Elias pressed his ear to the gap and listened. Voices, 2, maybe 3 men, and underneath their conversation, a sound that made his stomach clench, the quiet, pained breathing of someone trying not to make noise. "Told you this would happen if you didn't pay attention." Spider's voice, cold and clinical. "But you had to go and make friends with some do-gooder who thinks he can save you." "I gave you the 50, Dante's voice, thick and strained. "I'm getting the rest." "When? Next week? Next month? I'm tired of waiting, kid. And I'm tired of you thinking this is some kind of negotiation." Elias pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal. The warehouse district was a dead zone, cut off from the rest of the world by steel and concrete and the kind of isolation that made terrible things possible. He pushed the door open wider and slipped inside. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows and echoing space. Somewhere in the darkness, a generator hummed, providing power for the single bulb that hung from a cord near the far wall. 3 figures stood in the circle of light, Spider and 2 other men Elias didn't recognize. Between them, Dante sat tied to a wooden chair, his head hanging forward and his shirt torn. Spider was talking, his voice carrying clearly in the empty space. "See, the thing about debt is that it's not just about money, it's about respect, about understanding your place in the world. And your place, kid, is wherever I say it is." One of the other men, a huge guy with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward and backhanded Dante across the face. The sound echoed off the warehouse walls like a gunshot. Elias felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, about the kind of violence that fed on fear and grew stronger in darkness. He pulled out his wallet and checked the contents. $37 in cash, a credit card that was nearly maxed out, and his driver's license. Not much to bargain with, but it was what he had. Taking a deep breath, Elias stepped into the light. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Spider turned, his pale eyes reflecting the overhead bulb like a cat's. "Well, well, if it isn't, nobody. Come to rescue your friend?" "I've come to settle his debt." Spider's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Is that right? And what makes you think you can afford my prices?" Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, along with the folded $50 bill he'd been saving for Sofia's Christmas presents. $200. Cash, right now." "200? Spider's smile widened. "Oh, nobody. You really don't understand how this works, do you? The debt isn't 200 anymore. Interest compounds daily, late fees accumulate. By my calculation, this little shit owes me closer to 400 now. Then I'll owe you 200. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Spider's smile faltered slightly, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Say that again." "You heard me. I'll take on his debt. $200. To be paid within 30 days. Leave the kid alone." For a moment, the warehouse was silent except for the hum of the generator and Dante's labored breathing. Then Spider began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the concrete walls. "You want to trade places with him? Take on debt to a man you've never met? For a kid who robbed you blind?" "That's right." "Why?" Elias thought about Sofia, waiting at home with her homework, and her quiet faith in her father's goodness. About Carmen, who'd believed that everyone deserved a chance to choose something different. About the man he wanted to be versus the man he was afraid he'd become. Because it's the right thing to do. Spider studied him for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating. Finally, he nodded to the big man, who cut the ropes binding Dante to the chair. "All right, nobody, you've got yourself a deal. 30 days, $400, or we have another conversation. And next time, there won't be any negotiations." As Dante stumbled forward, Elias caught him, feeling the young man's weight against his shoulder. They walked together toward the loading dock, toward the cold air and the promise of safety beyond. But as they reached the door, Spider called after them. "Nobody, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Outside, in the snow-covered parking lot, Dante finally spoke. "Why did you do that?" Elias helped him into the passenger seat of his truck, noting the bruises on his face and the careful way he moved. Because somebody had to. "He'll come after you now, he won't forget this." "I know." $400, Elias. I don't have $400. "You don't have $400. Elias started the engine, letting it warm up while he considered their options. $400 might as well have been $4,000, given his current situation. But looking at Dante's battered face, at the mixture of gratitude and guilt in his eyes, Elias knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. "We'll figure something out," he said finally. "We've got 30 days. But as they drove through the empty streets toward home, both men knew that 30 days wasn't nearly enough time to find $400 when you were already counting every penny just to survive. 3 days passed like holding your breath underwater. Elias went through the motions of normal life, making Sofia breakfast, walking her to the bus stop, looking for work that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. But underneath it all was the constant weight of Spider's threat. The knowledge that he'd traded his family's security for a stranger's freedom. On the 4th morning, Sofia asked the question he'd been dreading. "Papá, why do you keep looking out the window?" They were sitting at the kitchen table, she with her bowl of cereal, and he with his coffee growing cold in his hands. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, beautiful and deceptive in its innocence. "Just checking the weather, Micha." "No, you're not." She set down her spoon and fixed him with that direct gaze that reminded him so much of Carmen. "You're watching for someone. Someone you're worried about." Elias felt his chest tighten, 10 years old, and she could read him like a book written in her native language. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." That's what you said when Mama was sick, right up until she wasn't fine anymore. The comparison hit him like a physical blow. He reached across the table and took her small hand in his, feeling the delicate bones beneath soft skin. Sofia, I promise you, everything is going to be okay. Do you promise, or just regular promise? Promise was their highest level of commitment, reserved for the most important things. Like promising to always love her, or promising that they'd find a way to make Christmas special even when money was tight. Promise, he said, and hoped it wasn't a lie. That afternoon, while Sofia was at school, Elias sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to perform the impossible mathematics of their situation. Rent, $800. Electric bill, $150. Groceries, $200. Sofia's school lunch account, $50. And now, somehow, $400 for Spider. The numbers didn't add up. No matter how he arranged them, no matter how optimistic his projections for odd jobs and emergency work, there wasn't enough money to cover everything. Something would have to give. He was still staring at the hopeless equations when the knock came. Soft at first, then more insistent. Elias looked through the peephole and saw Dante standing on the other side of the door, his face pale but determined. He carried a paper bag in one hand and something that might have been hope in his eyes. "I brought groceries," Dante said when Elias opened the door. "And something else." The bag contained milk, bread, eggs, and the makings for a simple dinner. But it was the envelope Dante pulled from his coat pocket that made Elias's breath catch. $450, Dante said, setting the envelope on the kitchen table. Enough to pay Spider and have something left over. Elias stared at the money like it might be a mirage. "Where did you get this?" "Day labor. Construction cleanup downtown, 12 hours a day for 3 days, cash under the table." Dante's voice was hoarse, exhausted. The foreman said if I kept showing up on time and working hard, he might have something more permanent after the holidays. "Dante," Elias picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of it. "This is your money, your fresh start. It's our money. You risked everything for me. The least I can do is make sure Spider doesn't come after your family." Before Elias could respond, Sofia's voice called from the doorway, "Papa, who's here?" She stood at the edge of the kitchen, her backpack still slung over her shoulder and snow melting from her boots. Her dark eyes moved from her father to Dante with the curious intensity of a child trying to solve an adult puzzle. "Sofia, this is Dante, the friend I told you about." Dante looked uncomfortable under her scrutiny, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a teenager meeting his girlfriend's parents. "Hi. Are you the one Papa's been worried about?" The directness of the question made both men blink. Dante glanced at Elias, then back at Sofia. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." Sofia nodded gravely as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she smiled, bright and sudden as sunrise. "Are you staying for dinner? Papa makes really good spaghetti, but he always makes too much." "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Elias said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Your family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Dante's eyes widened, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Family?" "The kind you choose," Sofia said matter-of-factly, hanging her backpack on its hook by the door. "Mama always said the best families are the ones where people choose to love each other." That evening, they sat around the small kitchen table sharing pasta and conversation. Dante told Sofia about the construction job, about the foreman who'd given him a chance despite his lack of references. Sofia told Dante about school, about her teacher who made math fun, and her best friend who was moving to California after Christmas. As they talked, Elias watched the easy way they related to each other. Sofia's natural warmth melting Dante's defensive walls, Dante's genuine interest in her stories making her glow with attention. It felt like something he'd forgotten was possible, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who cared about each other. After dinner, while Sofia worked on homework at the table, Dante helped Elias with the dishes. They worked in comfortable silence until Dante finally spoke. "About the money," he said quietly, "I want you to take it." "Dante." "Not just for Spider. For everything. Rent, groceries, whatever Sofia needs." His voice was steady, determined. You gave me something nobody else ever has. What's that? A chance to be better than what I was. Elias dried his hands on a dish towel, thinking about the choices that had led them to this moment. 3 days ago, he'd been a man worried about keeping the lights on and putting food on the table. Now he was someone else entirely, someone who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is the right thing. Keep half, he said finally. Use it to get a real place to live, maybe some work clothes for that construction job. But I'll take the rest, and I'll pay Spider what we owe. We? You think you're getting rid of me that easy? Elias smiled. I told Spider I'd take on your debt. Far as I'm concerned, that makes us partners now. Dante stared at him for a long moment, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Then he nodded, quick and sharp, like he was sealing a pact. Partners, he agreed. From the kitchen table, Sofia's voice piped up. Does this mean Dante's coming for Christmas Eve? Because we're making tamales, and Mama always said tamales taste better when you make them with people you love. Elias and Dante looked at each other, then at the small girl who'd just redefined the boundaries of their makeshift family. If he wants to, Elias said. I want to, Dante said quietly. I'd like that very much. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the neighborhood in clean white possibility. Inside, 3 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances began planning for a Christmas that would be unlike any they'd ever known. Not because of what they had, but because of who they'd chosen to share it with. The next morning, Elias would take the money to Spider and close the book on that particular debt. But tonight, sitting in his warm kitchen with his daughter and the young man who'd somehow become family, he felt richer than he'd felt in years. Sometimes, he thought, the most valuable things couldn't be counted in dollars and cents. Sometimes they could only be counted in moments like this, quiet evenings when love multiplied instead of divided, when hope proved stronger than fear, and when the simple act of choosing to trust someone turned strangers into family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new chances to prove that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. But tonight they had each other, and for now, that was enough. Christmas Eve arrived dressed in silver and white, the kind of crystalline morning that made the whole world look like it had been dipped in starlight. Sofia woke before dawn, as she always did on holidays, her excitement too bright to be contained by sleep. Elias found her at the kitchen window, still in her pajamas, watching snow fall in fat, lazy flakes that caught the light from the street lamps. It's perfect, she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Elias wrapped his arms around her from behind, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. Perfect for what, Mia? For everything. For tamales and Christmas lights and having Dante here. She leaned back against his chest, solid and warm in his embrace. Mama would have liked him, wouldn't she? The question hit him like it always did when Sofia spoke of Carmen in the present tense, as if her mother were simply in the next room instead of 2 years in the ground. But this morning, instead of the usual ache, he felt something softer, something that might have been peace. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, she would have loved him, because he makes you smile again. Elias paused, considering this. When had he started smiling again? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but somewhere in the past week, the weight he'd been carrying since Carmen's death had shifted. Not disappeared. It would never disappear completely, but changed into something more manageable, something that left room for other things. Maybe he does, he admitted. By the time Dante arrived at 9 o'clock, the kitchen was already filled with the rich scents of masa and spiced pork. Sofia had appointed herself his assistant, measuring ingredients with scientific precision and explaining the history of their family tamale recipe with the seriousness of a food historian. Bisabuela Rosa taught Abuela Maria, who taught Mama, who taught Papa, who's teaching me, she said, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. And now we're teaching you, so you're part of the chain. Dante stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, Sofia covered in flour, Elias stirring masa in a large bowl, the kitchen table covered with corn husks and small bowls of filling. His face held an expression Elias had never seen before, wonder mixed with something that might have been hunger, not for food but for belonging. I don't know how to make tamales, Dante said. That's okay, Sofia said with characteristic 10-year-old confidence. Nobody knows how until somebody teaches them. That's how learning works. For the next 3 hours, they worked together in the small kitchen, their movements gradually synchronizing into a rhythm that felt as old as the recipe itself. Dante proved surprisingly adept at spreading masa, his long fingers working with careful precision. Sofia appointed herself quality control supervisor, testing each tamale to ensure proper filling distribution and corn husk tightness. Elias found himself watching them more than working, marveling at how naturally they'd fallen into step with each other. Sofia explained everything with patient enthusiasm, and Dante listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that he was being offered more than cooking lessons. The secret, Sofia said, demonstrating the proper way to tie a tamale, is to make sure they're snug but not too tight, like a hug. Firm enough to feel safe, but not so tight you can't breathe. Dante fumbled with his corn husk, trying to replicate her technique. Like this? Perfect! Sofia beamed. You're a natural. As the afternoon wore on, the pile of finished tamales grew, each one representing another shared moment, another thread in the fabric they were weaving together. Elias told stories about Carmen's cooking, about Christmas mornings when she would wake before dawn to start the masa, filling their small apartment with warmth and possibility. Dante shared fragments of his own history, sparse Christmas memories from foster homes, the year he was 12 and spent Christmas Eve alone in an emergency shelter, the way he'd learned to expect disappointment so that any small kindness felt like a miracle. This is the first time I've made anything from scratch, he admitted, carefully placing his latest creation in the steamer. Usually I just heat things up or eat them cold. Well, now you know, Sofia said matter-of-factly, and knowing is the first step toward everything else. As evening settled over the neighborhood, they sat down to their feast. The tamales were perfect, tender masa yielding to savory filling, each bite carrying the weight of tradition and the promise of new memories being made. They ate by the light of the small Christmas tree Sofia had decorated, with handmade ornaments and strings of lights that cast everything in warm gold. After dinner they moved to the living room, where Sofia had arranged her Christmas cards on the coffee table like a gallery exhibition. She showed Dante each one, explaining the story behind every crayon stroke and glitter application. This one's for you, she said, handing him a card decorated with a snowman wearing what appeared to be a mechanic's coveralls. I made it yesterday. Dante opened the card and read the message inside, written in Sofia's careful script. Thank you for making my papa happy again. Love, Sofia. For a moment he couldn't speak. He held the card like it was made of spun glass, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me. It's just a card, Sofia said, but she glowed with pride. No, Dante said seriously. It's not just a card, it's family. As the evening deepened, they played cards by the tree lights, their voices mixing with the soft sounds of snow against the windows and the distant echo of Christmas carols from other apartments. Sofia fell asleep curled against Elias's side, her head on his shoulder and one hand still clutching her deck of cards. Dante helped him carry her to bed, watching with something like reverence as Elias tucked her under her blankets and kissed her forehead. Sweet dreams, mija, Elias whispered. Night, Papa. Night, Dante, she mumbled, already half asleep. Back in the living room, the two men sat in comfortable silence, watching the Christmas tree lights blink in slow, hypnotic patterns. Outside, the world was wrapped in snow and starlight, quiet except for the occasional sound of a car making its careful way down the slick streets. I need to tell you something, Dante said finally. Elias turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on the young man's face. I met with Spider yesterday, paid him the money, like we planned. Dante's voice was steady, but Elias could hear the underlying tension. He's not happy about how things went down, but he took the cash and said we're square. And he said he wouldn't forget. About you, about what you did. Dante met his eyes. I don't think he'll come after us directly, but he's the type to hold grudges. We should be careful. Elias nodded, filing the information away. There would always be men like Spider in the world, predators who fed on desperation and weakness. But sitting here in his warm living room, watching his daughter sleep safely in her bed, while a young man he'd helped save sat beside him like a son, Elias found he wasn't afraid. We'll deal with whatever comes, he said. Together. Dante smiled, the expression transforming his face from something guarded and sharp into something open and hopeful. Together, he agreed. They sat in silence for a while longer, two men who'd found family in the most unlikely circumstances. Finally, Dante stood to leave, pulling on his coat and gathering the leftover tamales Sofia had insisted he take home. "Thank you," he said at the door, "for everything. For believing I was worth saving when I didn't believe it myself. Thank you for proving me right." After Dante left, Elias sat alone in his living room, surrounded by the detritus of their celebration. Empty plates, playing cards scattered on the coffee table, the warm glow of Christmas lights reflecting off surfaces made precious by shared laughter. He thought about Carmen, about what she would make of this strange turn their lives had taken. The man who'd stolen their last $50 had become the person who'd helped them remember what family really meant. Not just blood, but choice. Not just need, but love freely given. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the neighborhood in clean white possibility. Inside, Elias Moreno sat in his small apartment and felt richer than he'd felt in years. Not in money, but in the things that mattered. Love, hope, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful gifts came wrapped in the most unlikely packages. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to prove that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. But tonight, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the lingering warmth of shared tamales, Elias was content to simply sit in the quiet after, grateful for the family he'd found and the man he'd remembered how to be. In the morning, he would wake to find Sofia already dressed and excited for Christmas Day. There would be modest gifts under their tree, nothing expensive but everything chosen with love. And sometime in the afternoon, Dante would return with a small present of his own. A photograph he'd taken of the three of them making tamales, their faces bright with flour and joy. But for now, in the hushed silence of Christmas Eve night, Elias simply sat and smiled, surrounded by the quiet magic of a season that had taught him that the best gifts couldn't be bought or sold, only shared from one heart to another. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.